Hello everybody and welcome back to this video where we're going to be going over placing objects inside of our level. If you remember last time, we hit Control Space to open up our content browser, went into our starter content, and then dragged in a pillar from our architecture folder. But this time around I'm going to go into this props folder and I'm going to drag in a chair. Bop, there it is. I'm going to hit F to center my camera on that chair. And we can see that we have a little movement gizmo, same thing we had with Maya. Now by default, when you first drag an object into your level, Unreal will try and snap it to the nearest floor. If you drag something in and it doesn't snap to the ground, what you can simply do is pull it up until it's floating in the sky, and then hit the End key on your keyboard, and that'll snap it to the ground. Now let's talk about the widgets. So first off, we have our movement widget. This is under W, same as it was in Maya, but notice that the blue arrow is now pointing up. Z is now up instead of Y, which is one of the key differences between Maya and Unreal. And just like in Maya, we can go ahead and move our object by selecting the arrows. But you'll notice that as I move it, it sort of jitters. The reason that it's jittering is because of the snap tools. So if I look over here at the top right of my viewport, I have these three tools, and these three numbers, they're highlighted blue. So currently I have this grid that says enables or disables snapping to the grid with a unit of 10. So if I pay close attention to my numbers here in my location value, as I move the object, my Z value always goes up and down in increments of 10. Same thing with the other values. If I don't want it to snap at those distances, I can click this grid button, and now it moves nice and smooth. I can also go ahead and leave my snap on and change the units. So let's say I want to move my chair every 100 units, then the jitter will become quite a bit larger, but I can make sure that it's snapping to an appropriately sized grid. So that's movement under the W key. Same thing as with Maya, E is for rotate. And again, I have that same, if you can see that little number, increments of 10 degrees. That's because my rotate snap is currently set to 10, and I can go ahead and change that in increments as well, or turn it on and off. And then lastly, my scale tool, which is R, which allows me to change the size of the object. And the scale tool also has a snap feature, but it's less noticeable. But you can also go ahead and change how big increments you want to scale your object in. Let's go ahead and undo that and bring this back down to the default, 0.25. So all of the transform tools are fairly similar, except for the fact that up is now Z. Now, if you remember from duplicating in Maya, before we used to hold Shift and use one of the arrows to duplicate objects. That no longer works inside of Unreal. If you hold Shift while you are dragging the object, instead you will move the camera along with the object as you move it. If you want a quick and easy duplicate, you instead hold Alt and drag out a copy. If you hold Alt and Shift at the same time, then you will drag a copy and move the camera. So that is a quick and easy way to duplicate copies of an object. Now that's the bare bones of grabbing an object from the content browser, but let's say we want something a lot simpler. Up here underneath the third person map, we've got two things, the selection mode and this little square with a plus button. If I click the square with a plus button, this drop-down gives me a selection of basic objects to add to my level. If I look inside of the Simple Basic tab, we've got the actor, character, and pawn selections, which we won't be using for now. The important ones for us are the point light, which if I simply drag in, is a area light the same way we would have them in Maya, and the player start, which defines where the player spawns in. Now our default level already has a player start object, so if I go ahead and delete the old one, I will now spawn at the new one when I hit the play button. So now I'm over here instead of over there. Other things we have inside of this little square box, we've got lights. So in addition to the basic point light, which we have over here, we also have, let's pull this back up, a directional light, which functions as the sun. We already have one of those in the default level, which is this one over here. If I go ahead and rotate it, you'll notice that the time of day in my level changes. That's the power of the directional light. We also have a couple more lights. We've got the spotlight, which works top down. You can sort of see that spotlight right there. We can go ahead and make it a little darker so that it shows up a little better. There we go. So there's my spotlight. We also have a rec light, which is like a spotlight, but it's square. And then finally we have the sky dome light, which in this level is being controlled by the directional light. So let's go ahead and readjust that real quick. Other objects we have in here are the shapes. So we've got simple shapes, we've got a cube. Let's go ahead and pull that up and snap it to the ground with the end key. We've got a sphere, same thing, cylinder, cone, and plane. Now it's important to note that all of these objects, these physical objects, are called SM static mesh actors. So if I pull open my outliner, you'll notice over here that I have static mesh actor, chair, cube, ramp, etc. A static mesh is a simple object that can interact with the player and doesn't have animations. You will notice that by default, underneath my channel box settings, I have this mobility setting, which is currently set to static on the sphere. What that means is if I, as a player, walk into it, it won't move. The object is static. Same thing goes for my chair, same thing goes for most of these blocks, except for these blue ones, which I can kick around. The reason for that is if I select any of these blue boxes, we can see that my mobility is set to movable instead of static. There's another important setting that allows them to move, which is if I scroll down here, I have Simulate Physics turned on. If we go back to my chair, Simulate Physics is currently turned off. Let's check that on, scroll back up, and you can see that my mobility has automatically changed to movable. Now when I hit play, I can turn around, go back over to my chair, and kick it around. Note that the more movable objects you have in the scene, the more your level will slow down. Unreal's generally pretty good at maintaining several movable objects, but it can get a bit messy on slower machines. Now for the lights, the static and movable settings mean slightly different things. So for instance, if I select the lights, you'll notice that by default they are stationary. That means they are not designed to move, but you can change their colors in the middle of the game. Say for instance your player ends up on low health, you can change them from a white to a red. However, because they're stationary, if we go ahead and copy some of them and make them overlap, we eventually get these red X's that say you have too many lights overlapping, and that's a problem. If you want to fix that issue, all you have to do is change them to static, which means that they won't be updating during the game. Now the most costly option is to make them movable, which is in case a player were to, say, bump into a lamp and you wanted it to swing. This is incredibly pricey and will slow down slow machines. Now we've talked about the static meshes and the lights, so let's talk about the next thing I'd like to add into my level, which is a brush. So if I pop open my little menu and go down to the bottom just above the recently placed objects, I have this Place Actors panel. And if I go ahead and click that, I get the same options as my little drop down, just as a separate window. However, I do have a couple of additional options here. Specifically, I care about this Geometry tab. And what this allows me to do is drag in one of these objects that look like static meshes but aren't. There we go. So here's a couple. Let's drag in the box And let's also drag in the curved stair to play with. And now what I'm going to do is up here in the top left, I'm going to change my mode from selection to brush editing. And you'll also notice that in this tab there is a landscape and foliage tool, which we might get to in later modules. But for now we're going to go to brush editing. And what that's going to allow me to do is, while I have one of these brushes selected, note box brush, curved stair brush, I can now edit this model as if it were a model in Maya. I can select faces and vertices and edges, though the edges are a bit tricky to grab, and I can go ahead and move them around the same way I would a model in Maya. I can also, over here, use the extrude tool, for instance. Let's go ahead and hit that again, hit apply, and now I have an extrusion. We can go ahead and drag some more extrusions out of this box. Same thing we can do with the stairs if we really wanted to. Select the face and extrude it. And these tools allow us to edit these brushes to create some slightly more complex shapes very, very easily. Let's go ahead and undo that. In addition to this brush editing mode, let's go back to selection mode. I can go ahead and select this staircase, and if I scroll down over here, let's see if I can remember the settings. Yes, if we scroll down over here with my stair selected, in my attribute editor, my details panel, I have brush settings. So I can change the radius of my stairs. Let's go ahead and make them a bit thinner. Make them a bit larger, I suppose. Let's go ahead and change the step height. Let's go ahead and make that shorter. Maybe want the steps to be shorter. Let's go ahead and make those thinner. Let's change the angle of the curve. So if I didn't want this to be a curved staircase, I could change the angle of the curve to 0. That breaks the model. But if I set this to, let's say 45, then we get a slightly less inclined stairs. So this is a way of creating slightly more complex shapes. Very simple instructions. And then while I'm also in this brush settings, you might also notice that I have this brush type additive. If I go ahead and drag this staircase so that it's intersecting the cube, there we go. So I have my staircase stuck in the other object. I can go ahead and change my brush type from additive to subtractive. And what that'll do is it'll cut a stair-shaped hole inside of the cube. So let's go ahead and try and reselect my staircase by selecting a face on the inside of that cube. Let's pull that up. Let's rotate it so that the staircase is upside down. And let's drag it slightly this way so that it intersects differently with the cube. Maybe rotate it a bit more. And you can see that cut a little bit better. So you can create some really interesting shapes by using these brushes, adding them in, modifying them with the brush editing tool, and then changing some of them from additive to subtractive. If you wanted to create something a little bit more useful than a rock with a stair hole in it, we can go ahead and delete these. And let's say we wanted to make a really quick bucket. I can drag in a cylinder, shrink it down, go ahead and drag a copy by holding Alt, shrink that one down, and then put the smaller one on subtractive, push it down a bit, and let's increase the radius just a bit, and let's call that a bucket or a well. And that's a quick and easy way of using these BSP brushes, which stands for binary space partitioning. Basically, which spaces are yes and which spaces are no. Now we've talked about static meshes and lights and BSP brushes. There's a couple more things I'd like to talk about. First is blueprints, which are effectively, for our purposes, collections of other things. So if, for instance, I pop open my starter content and look inside of this blueprints folder, we have two that we care about, the ceiling light and the wall sconce. So if I drag in a ceiling light, it'll snap to the floor, but if I pull it up, this is effectively a lamp with a little yellow spotlight underneath. Isn't that nice? Same thing goes with the sconce. If I drag that in, let go of it, we have this little wall lamp which we can slap close to the wall over here, and you can see that it also comes with its own light. So blueprints, for our purposes right now, are just objects that are combined, so in this case a static mesh and a light, so that we can have an easier time adding in those lights to a level. The final thing I'd like to talk about are materials. So if we come back to our starter content real quick, pop open our materials tab. These are all of the starter content materials which we can use in our level. Let's go ahead and pop in, whoops, wrong tab. Pop in our content browser here, just dock that in layout. So what we can do with our materials for most simple objects is simply select one of these and drag it onto an object. And now we've converted our floor into rock. Let's go ahead and use a slightly flatter texture. Don't like the grid. Let's do brushed nickel. So there we go. Our floor is now made of metal. We can go ahead and do the same thing to one of these static meshes. So let's go ahead and make this cube gold. There we go. Now it's got a golden texture. We can do the same thing to the BSP brushes, but the BSP brushes are slightly different because every face counts as its own object. So I can go ahead and, one at a time, apply wood to each face. But maybe I want a couple of faces to be slightly different. So, ooh, not water. Let's go with a different type of wood. Maybe these three faces have a slightly different polish. How about that? So that is how you can apply quick and dirty materials to your objects as you are building things out. Alright, that's going to do it for this video. Join me in the next one where we actually build out a simple room. Then let's pop over to OBS and stop recording.